The first thing Cale Morrow noticed about the Vanguard Academy was how quiet it got when he walked in. Not the polite quiet of a room noticing a new arrival. The other kind. The kind that spreads from table to table the way frost spreads across glass, slow, deliberate, complete. He had his duffel over one shoulder and a transfer chip in his hand, and the mess hall of the most decorated interspecies military academy in the known systems had gone still enough that he could hear the hum of the atmospheric processors in the walls. He was human, that was the whole of it. There were 43 species represented in that room, cadets from 16 star systems, and most of them had never seen a human in uniform before. They'd seen humans in trade ports, in medical bays, in the cramped worker quarters of deep space stations. They'd seen humans as technicians, as miners, as translators, as the small busy creatures who kept the interstellar economy running on schedule. A few of the older cadets had seen humans in battle, grainy footage from the Karath corridor, the kind of footage that made the rounds in military circles with the same grim fascination as disaster reels. But none of them had seen a human here. Here at the Vanguard, the oldest and hardest military institution in 3 sectors, where the galaxy sent its best to be broken, and if they survived, rebuilt into something worth fearing. Cale found his assigned table, set his tray down and sat. The Drelhari cadet across from him, a species that communicated partially through the subtle shift of bioluminescent patches on their throat, flickered something that translated, roughly, as amusement combined with pity. The 2 Tessak cadets to his left did not look at him at all, which was its own kind of statement. The single Velthari at the end of the bench, a species known for their bladed forearm structures and their remarkable capacity for stillness, watched him with her compound eyes and said nothing. Cale ate his meal. It tasted like compressed protein and synthetic mineral paste, the same as every military ration he'd ever eaten. He ate it methodically, without complaint, and when the mess hall found something else to look at, he breathed a little easier. He was used to being the thing people looked at. His left hand rested on the table while he ate, the way it always did. The tattoo was visible, it always was. A marking that covered the back of his hand from the base of his fingers to his wrist in dense, interlocking geometries. Old ink, old design, old meaning. The kind of thing that made people look twice on a station or in a port and then look away. The kind of thing you didn't explain to strangers, because strangers didn't have the context for it and you didn't have the patience to build it. He was not a sword of justice, not yet. That was the whole problem. The Vanguard Academy operated on a simple principle. You were not a soldier until the proving said you were. Everything before the proving was practice. Everything after it was real. The proving itself was an individual combat trial, not a simulation, not a scored exercise, but an actual engagement against a combat-rated opponent selected from a roster of beings the Academy described, with bureaucratic understatement, as challenging. You went in. You came out. What you'd learned about yourself in between was the point. Cale had requested his proving assignment within 48 hours of arrival. The administrator who processed his request, a Velthari named Sarenval with 3 decades of academy service behind her, had looked at the form, looked at him, and then looked at the form again. "You've been here 2 days," she said. 47 hours. You haven't completed the prerequisite assessment rotations. I've completed equivalent assessments at Helix Station under Commander Tashori of the 14th Mobile. I have the records. Sarenval examined the records. She was very good at not showing what she was thinking. Velthari usually were. After a long moment she said, "The request will be logged. The assignment committee will review it." "I understand." "Cadet Morrow," she paused, "I would not recommend rushing the proving." "I know," he said, "I'm not rushing it." He didn't explain further. He gathered his forms and left. What he didn't say to anyone, was that he already knew which assignment he was going to request. He'd known before he set foot in the building. He'd known since he was 11 years old, and his father sat him down at the kitchen table on the station where they lived and told him about the Vanguard Compact, the alliance of species that had held 3 sectors together for 2 centuries, and the 4 warriors who had founded it. Not politicians, not diplomats, warriors. The ones who had stood in the breach when everything else had failed, who had bled together in the cold of deep space until the bleeding meant something, until the something became a promise that held. His father had told him about them, and Cale had asked, as an 11-year-old asks things, whether humans could join. His father had said he didn't know. He'd said it was a complicated question. Cale had spent 17 years finding out that the answer was, in practice, no, and then enrolling anyway. The tattoo had been his grandmother's first. She had gotten it on her right hand, in the year before the Karath Corridor, when the human volunteer brigades were being organized, and people were trying to find ways to make soldiers out of civilians who had nothing to hold onto but each other. The old woman who'd drawn it, a veteran of 2 prior engagements, someone who had been in the corridor and survived it and come back changed, had told her that the pattern was not decorative. That each interlocking figure in the design had a specific meaning, a specific weight, and that to wear it was to carry something, not a burden, a reminder. The reminder was this: you have been here before, in the dark and the cold, without any reason to believe the next breath would come. You have been here and you stayed and you kept going, and somewhere in your hands and in your blood is the memory of that. It doesn't live in your head, it lives in your hands. His grandmother had passed it to his mother had passed it to him. He had redrawn it on his left hand at age 16, in a room above a machine shop on Helix Station, with a woman who did not ask why he wanted it. She had only asked whether he understood what it meant to carry something like this. He had said yes. She had said she hoped so. Then she had worked for 4 hours in near silence, and when she was done she had wrapped his hand and told him to keep it clean. He had kept it clean. He had kept everything clean. He had been keeping things clean and quiet and ready for a very long time, and now he was here, and his request was in, and he was waiting. The class was combat theory, tactical response, and biological variance. The instructor was a Varchani named HFY, a species that communicated with tonal variation, and whose combat methodology had been studied and copied, and never successfully replicated by 6 other species over 3 centuries. HFY was ancient by human standards, lean in the way old fighters get lean, not wasted, just stripped of everything unnecessary. And she moved with the specific economy of motion that told you every step she took was exactly the step she meant to take. She was running them through response scenarios, projected holograms of battlefield geometries spun in the air above the central demonstration floor. Cadets were called forward, one by one, to assess and respond. Cale watched. He was in the back row, which was where he'd been assigned, and he watched the way he'd always watched things, without moving, without expression, with the particular quality of attention that his old training sergeant at Helix had called the counting look. She'd said it with some affection. She'd said it because when Cale had the counting look, he was usually right. A Tessak cadet named Vreeth was called forward. She was excellent fast assessment, clean deployment language, correct flanking geometry. HFY acknowledged the response without warmth, which at the Vanguard constituted high praise. Then HFY said, "Cadet Morrow." He came forward. The hologram shifted to a new configuration, a 3-point breach, multiple hostiles, degraded communications, wounded friendly at position 6. He looked at it for 4 seconds. "Hostile density at point 2 is a feint," he said. "Real pressure is coming from 7 and 9 in rotation. Defensive anchor here, withdrawal corridor here, but only if the wounded at 6 can move. If they can't move, you don't anchor, you collapse inward and you spend the time you just bought getting them out." Silence. HFY studied the hologram. She made a small adjustment to the configuration and said, "And if they cannot be moved?" Then you don't leave them. At the cost of the anchor position. At the cost of the anchor position. Another silence. Osek 3 looked at him with the compound-eyed, unreadable expression of a Virchani who had processed something unexpected and was deciding what to do with it. Then she said, "Correct," and called the next cadet. He went back to the rear row. The Drelhari cadet, whose name he'd learned by then, Sherv, turned to look at him. The bioluminescent patches at their throat pulsed once, a color combination that translated as surprise softened by something that might have been reconsideration. Kale didn't say anything. He'd gotten used to that color too. The proving assignment came back 12 days after he'd filed it. He was eating breakfast when Sarenval herself walked into the mess hall, an event sufficiently unusual that the room went through the same quiet ripple it had when Kale first arrived, and handed him a data chip directly. No intermediary. No admin runner. She handed it to him personally, which meant she'd walked all the way from the administrative wing to do it, which meant she wanted to see his face when he read it. He read it. Varkazin, the boundary striker, eldest of the four, the Compact's most ancient and undefeated combat challenge. A being who had fought in the founding wars, who had been present at the signing of every major treaty in the Alliance, who currently resided in the Deep Systems facility known as the Iron Reach, a decommissioned weapons complex that had been repurposed as a combat trial ground precisely because nothing built in the last 100 years could damage its structure. Sarenval said, "The committee noted that no cadet has requested this assignment in 31 years. I know. The last cadet who accepted it was a Tessak. He survived the trial. He required 3 months of reconstruction and 2 years of therapy before he could function. I know. He did not pass. I know." Sarenval looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. "It wasn't a challenge." It was the question she'd walked all the way across the academy to ask. He looked at the chip in his hand. He thought about what to say and decided on something close to honest. "Because it's the right one," he said. She did not ask him to explain what that meant. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she had seen the look that went with words like that before. She turned and walked back toward the administrative wing, and Kale sat in the mess hall with the chip in his hand and the tattoo visible on the back of it and thought about his grandmother, and the woman above the machine shop, and the old training sergeant who had called it the counting look. He was counting now. He was counting everything. The room where they called up your assignment and briefed you on the opposition was a long, low chamber off the main tactical wing, with a curved display wall on one end, and seating for approximately 80 cadets and instructors. It was called, without irony, the Clarity Room. The idea was that you went in not knowing what you were about to face and came out knowing exactly. Kale's briefing was scheduled for the 3rd day before his proving. He had not told anyone about the assignment. He had not needed to. The Vanguard ran on information the way stations ran on oxygen. Everyone breathed it, and nothing stayed contained for long. By the time he walked into the Clarity Room, it was full. Not full in the way briefings were normally full, the assigned cadets and a few instructors scattered through the rows. Full as in standing room, cadets pressed 3 deep against the back wall, 2 of the senior combat instructors standing at the side with expressions that communicated professional skepticism, and underneath it, the same quality of careful attention Kale recognized from his own face in mirrors. Osek 3 was there. Sarenval was there. Sherv was there, bioluminescent patches doing something complex and low. Kale walked to the front, because that was where the briefing subject stood, and he stood there while the display wall lit up with Varkazin. The boundary striker was not a creature you described simply. The holographic record that played for the room had been compiled from a dozen different encounters across 2 centuries, and what it showed was something that occupied space the way black holes occupied space, not by filling it, but by bending it. 3 meters of dense biological armor, limbs that operated on a joint system entirely unlike anything in the known biological catalog, a combat methodology that had been described by the Alliance's foremost military analysts as adaptive extinction-level response. He had ended wars. Literally. He had ended 2 of them by showing up at the critical engagement point and making one side's continued participation non-viable. He had never lost. The room was very quiet. The briefing officer, a Tessak named Vrethos who had been assigned this duty, Kale suspected, because the Academy wanted someone experienced enough to deliver the information without editorializing, ran through the tactical data with practiced efficiency. Varkazin's capabilities, his known response patterns, the structure of the Iron Reach, the parameters of a proving trial. What constituted a pass condition? What constituted failure? What constituted the kind of outcome that required emergency medical response? At the end of the briefing, Vrethos said, with the precise neutrality of someone choosing their words very carefully, "Are there questions?" Kale had one. Has he seen human combat before? Vrethos paused. There are records of limited engagements during the Karath corridor period. The boundary striker was present as an observer during the final engagement of the corridor campaign. He has assessed human combat methodology. What was his assessment? Another pause. Longer. Vrethos said. His assessment at the time was that human combat methodology was, and I am quoting from the compact record, insufficient to justify inclusion in the Vanguard Compact. The room was quiet. Kale nodded. He had known this. He had read every scrap of public record he could find. He had known this for years and had come anyway, had put in the request anyway, and was standing in front of this room of cadets and instructors and senior warriors, and the weight of that assessment anyway, and his hand was resting at his side with the tattoo visible, and he was not going to flinch about it. "Thank you," he said. "No further questions." He walked back to his seat. The room held its quiet around him like held breath. Somewhere behind him, he heard Sherv's bioluminescent patches clicking through colors he didn't have a translation for yet. There was a moment 2 nights before the proving when Kale could not sleep. This was not unusual. He had not slept well in years, not since Helix Station, not since the incident in the Karath survey sector that had taken 3 members of his original training unit and left him with a repaired shoulder and an understanding of mortality that he had never asked for but could not return. He had learned to make use of his sleepless hours. He did maintenance work, or ran scenarios in his head, or sat in whatever space he had access to and thought about the problem in front of him, until it stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a door. Tonight the space he had access to was the small observation deck off the cadet quarters, a narrow platform overlooking the Academy's exterior training ground. The lights of the installation were low, the Academy's equivalent of night, and the sky above was the deep, star-dense black of a clear orbital evening. He could see 3 of the station's 4 moons from here, their light falling pale and cold across the grounds below. He sat on the edge of the railing and looked at his hand. The tattoo was old enough now that the edges had softened slightly, the way old ink does, but the design was still crisp at its center. The interlocking figures, the geometries that meant things he had learned young and never forgotten, his grandmother's design, his mother's refinement. His addition, a single line along the inside edge of his wrist that had no old meaning, that he had added himself when he was 17 and had decided he understood what the rest of it was for. He had added it after the training sergeant told him about the counting look. The line meant, "I have counted everything, I am still here." He was still counting. He thought about his grandmother, who had gone into the Karath corridor and come back. He thought about what she had told him once, when he was 8 years old and had come home bruised from a fight with a boy 3 years older, a boy who had been making a particular kind of comment about humans that was common on mixed stations. She had sat across from him and looked at him for a long time, and then she had said, "Kale, the ones who mock you haven't seen you yet. Let them look." He had not understood that at 8. He thought he understood it now. He sat with the cold light of 3 moons on his hand and thought about Verkazen, who had watched the Karath corridor and decided humans were insufficient. And he thought about what it meant that the man who had built the architecture of the Alliance had never had to face the thing that made humans what they were, had never had to see it face to face in conditions where it had no choice but to come out. He thought about the frozen hold, the 3 instructors he'd heard about in the records, the senior Vanguard trainers who had been present at the last cadets proving attempt at the Iron Reach, who had tried to intervene when the trial went wrong and had been stopped by the facility's containment protocols. Frozen in place, not by anything Verkazen had done, but by the rules of the compact itself, which held that approving was approving and no outside party could interfere. They had watched, they couldn't help, that was the design. He would be alone in the Iron Reach. He looked at his hand. He thought about the line along his wrist. Then he went back inside and slept 4 hours, not well but enough. In the morning, Sheriff found him in the training corridor before the day's first rotations. The Drelhari cadet was young even by Drelhari standards, narrow-framed, with the elongated neck structure that their species used for directional bioluminescent communication, and a habit of approaching at an angle rather than directly, which Kale had learned was simply how Drelhari moved through social space, and not, as he had initially assumed, a form of skepticism. They had spoken perhaps 6 times since his arrival. Brief exchanges, course-focused, nothing personal. Sheriff stopped 2 meters away, and their throat patches cycled through something rapid and layered that the translation unit on Kale's collar processed, after a moment's delay, as, "Are you afraid of the Iron Reach?" Kale considered this. He could have said no, which would have been partly true. He could have said yes, which would also have been partly true. He said, "I'm afraid of the right things about it, not the wrong ones." Sheriff's patches shifted. The translation came through as, "What is the wrong thing to be afraid of?" "Failing, that's the wrong thing to be afraid of." He paused. "The right thing is making a mistake that costs someone else." The patches pulsed once, slow, the color he had identified as the Drelhari equivalent of a nod. "You are going to fight the boundary striker," Sheriff said. "He is not someone else. He will not be harmed by your mistakes." "No," Kale agreed. "But there are 3 senior instructors who were at the last proving attempt at the Iron Reach. They were present when it went wrong. They tried to intervene. The compact's protocols stopped them." He looked down the corridor. "They've been there. They know what it is. And they're going to be in the monitoring chamber this time, and they still won't be able to intervene if it goes the same way." He paused. "I don't want to put that on them." Sheriff was quiet for a moment. Their patches moved through several colors he didn't have clean translations for yet. Then they said, "My species has a thing we say. The direct translation is rough, but the best thing you can do for the ones who cannot help you is to not need help." Kale looked at them. "That's good. We have had many centuries to develop sayings about impossible situations," Sheriff said, in a tone that was, he was fairly sure, the Drelhari form of dry humor. "We are not a lucky species." He laughed. It surprised him a little, the ease of it here 2 days before the proving. "Neither are we," he said. "We just keep going anyway." Sheriff's patches lit up briefly with the color that meant something to be remembered. Then they moved off down the corridor, and Kale went to his morning rotation, and the counting in his head was steady and clean. The 3 senior instructors whose presence had been referenced in the Iron Reach records, the ones who had tried to intervene at the last proving and been stopped, were named Corinth, Vrethos, and a retired field commander named Salenveer, who had been brought in specifically as a consultant for this trial, because she had more recorded engagements with Verkazen's combat style in her personal data log than anyone else at the academy. Kale met with all 3 of them on the day before the proving. They had not requested the meeting. He had. He had gone to Sarenval and said he would like to speak with the monitoring team before the trial, and Sarenval had looked at him with the careful expression of someone deciding how much to say, and then she had arranged it. They met in one of the small tactical consultation rooms off the main instruction wing. 4 chairs, a small table, a window that looked out onto the training ground. Corinth was a Velthari, older than Sarenval, with the particular stillness of someone who had been still in many dangerous places, and learned that stillness was its own kind of armor. Vrethos Kale already knew from the briefing room. Salinvir was compact and close-eyed, and she had a scar along her left forearm that she had not had before the last Iron Reach trial, which was information he filed away quietly. He sat down across from them. He looked at their faces. He said, "I wanted to tell you that I understand the protocol situation, that you can't intervene, and that you shouldn't spend the trial trying to find a way around that, because there isn't one and the energy is better used elsewhere." They looked at him. "I know you were there before," he said. "I know how it went. I've read what's available. I'm not telling you it's going to go differently because I'm exceptional. I'm telling you it might go differently because the conditions are different. The cadet who was there last time was trying to represent themselves as something they weren't. I'm not doing that. Varkazen will be able to tell the difference." Salinvir said quietly, "How do you know that?" "Because everything in his record suggests he is exactly as perceptive as his reputation, and his reputation is that he sees clearly." Kale paused. "If he sees clearly and I come in as I am, not as what I want to be, not as what I'm pretending to be, just as what I actually am, then the engagement will be honest. And honest engagements at least have the right kind of information in them, even when they go badly." Corinth had not moved throughout the exchange. She said, "And if it goes badly?" "Then you'll be in the monitoring room," Kale said, "and you'll see it happen clearly, and that will matter for the next one who stands in front of him. Everything we do here is information for the ones who come after, even the failures. Especially the failures." The 3 instructors exchanged looks, the particular look of people who have been doing a hard thing for a long time and have just been given a frame for it they hadn't been holding before. Salinvir said, "You sound like someone who has thought about this for a very long time." 17 years, Kale said, "give or take." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, with the flat economy of a long-serving field officer, "Don't get frozen." It was the most practical advice he received in the lead-up to the proving. He took it seriously. Corinth added, after a pause, "The facility has a secondary lighting system in the northeast quadrant that activates automatically if primary goes down. If the primary goes down, go northeast. It is the most structurally stable zone. It was designed for weapons storage, and the walls will deflect more than the combat floor will." Kale looked at her. "That information isn't in the briefing files." "No," she said, "it is from personal experience." She paused. "Do not go down in the primary zone." He nodded. He committed it to the same internal space where he kept the counting, the clean, reliable place in the back of his skull, where things he needed were stored without sentiment. Vrethos said, "Morrow." He turned to look at her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised him, not the words themselves but the tone, which was not the briefing room neutrality she displayed before. It was something more human, which he recognized the instant he heard it in her alien voice. "We want you to come back." He looked at her. He thought about Cherv's color that meant something to be remembered. He thought about his grandmother and the 8-year-old he had been, and the distance between that kitchen table and this consultation room on the other side of the known systems. "I know," he said. "I'll try to make that easy for you." He got up and thanked them and went to finish preparing. The Iron Reach was 3 hours from the academy by transit pod. A slow arc through the outer installation ringed toward a structure that had been built for a purpose it no longer served, and now served a different one with the same cold efficiency. From the outside it looked like what it was, a weapons facility. Angular, massive, built for function rather than appearance, its outer surfaces still marked in places with the scoring of old energy impacts that no one had bothered to repair because the scoring was its own kind of history. Cale rode the transit pod alone. He had his kit, the standard proving loadout, the same for every cadet regardless of species, nothing custom, nothing additional. He spent the 3 hours thinking through the scenarios he'd run in his head for months, not combat plans exactly. Combat plans were for people who knew what they were going to face. He was building something more like a disposition, a set of orientations, a readiness of mind and body toward whatever came, without the rigidity of a fixed plan that could shatter. His grandmother had called it arriving open, her phrasing, not any tactical doctrines. He arrived open, the pod docked, the iron reach received him. The facility's interior was vast and cold and dark, in the specific way of spaces built for scale and violence. Ceilings high enough to accommodate combat forms 3 times Varkazen's size. Floors marked with containment boundaries whose geometry had meaning he hadn't fully decoded. Lighting that served function rather than comfort and left large stretches in deep shadow. He walked to the center floor as directed by the facility's automated guidance system and stood there and waited. He waited 7 minutes. Then Varkazen came out of the dark. The records had not done justice to the presence of him. The holographic footage had captured the size, the mass, the biological armor, the limb configuration. It had not captured the quality of attention he brought with him, the sense that the space in the room was being processed, categorized, assessed with a precision that made Cale feel, for the first time since arriving at the academy, genuinely small. Not in a humiliating way, in the way a person feels small standing at the base of a mountain. A factual smallness, a smallness that simply was. Varkazen stopped at the edge of the central floor and looked at him. The voice that came, through the facility's translation matrix, because Varkazen's biological speech fell outside the standard hearing range of 17 species including humans, was deep and level and patient in the way of someone who had been patient for a very long time, because they had found the universe generally not worth being impatient about. You are the human cadet. Cale Morrow, yes. You have filed for the proving assignment against me. I have. Do you know what this assignment is? I've read every available record. A pause. Varkazen moved slightly, not a combat movement, just a shift in weight, the kind of movement that in a human would have communicated recalibration. Why this assignment? Cale had been waiting for this question. He had prepared answers for it. He discarded most of them now and said the one that was true. Because you decided humans weren't sufficient. In the corridor, I want you to see what you missed. The silence after that was very long. Then Varkazen said, "We will begin." What happened next was not describable in the clean language of tactical reports, though Cale had written enough of those to know how they would have narrated it. Cadet engaged superior combatant. Initial exchanges established range parameters and response capability baselines. The language of reports filed away the thing that actually happened into acceptable boxes. The way a report of a storm might accurately describe wind speed and rainfall, while saying nothing about what it felt like to stand in it. What it felt like was this: being tested the way stone is tested, with sustained pressure, from every angle relentlessly. Varkazen was not cruel. That was the thing that surprised Cale most in the first exchange. He had expected the contempt of the assessment, insufficient, to translate into the engagement as something dismissive. It didn't. The boundary striker fought with the complete and total seriousness that Cale understood from everything he'd read and been told was the only way Varkazen knew how to fight. You got his full attention or you didn't fight him at all. There was no contempt in the full attention. There was only the reality of what he was, brought to bear. The first hit staggered Cale sideways 8 feet and left his shoulder numb, and the counting in his head clarified to one sharp, bright point. He was still here. He came back. The second exchange was longer. He read the limb geometry wrong on the initial approach and caught a glancing impact across his ribs that he had learned from training to breathe through, short exhale, recalibrate. Don't protect the injury, keep moving. He kept moving. The counting continued. Something had happened to time inside the iron reach. He was aware of this as a fact rather than a confusion. He'd experienced it before in the bad engagement in the Cadets survey sector, when the 3 members of his unit had gone down and time had done that thing where it both slowed and accelerated simultaneously, the way a burning fuse seems to move very slowly until it doesn't. He was in that time now. Everything was very clear. Everything was very slow. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. He could taste copper. His right knee had taken an impact that was going to make the next 24 hours interesting, and his shoulder was still numb but functional, and he was on his feet, and the counting in his head was sharp and clean, and it told him, not yet, not yet, not yet. In the third exchange, Varkezin changed his approach. Cale felt it before he understood it, a shift in the quality of the incoming pressure, the way the boundary striker was moving through the space around him differently. Not faster, not more powerful, but more intelligent. He was testing something specific now. Not just whether Cale could absorb punishment, but how he processed it. What he did between hits, whether he was adapting or just enduring. There was a difference. Varkezin was looking for the difference. Cale had been in situations before where a superior opponent shifted from destruction to assessment. It was a particular kind of danger. The danger of being truly seen by someone whose seeing could end you. He had learned in the Cadets survey sector, the hard way, that the right response was not to hide what he was doing but to be more of it, more deliberate, more honest. The opponent who was assessing you could not assess what they could not see clearly. The worst thing you could do was obscure yourself in panic. He stopped blocking and started redirecting. It was a simple shift mechanically, using Varkezin's own momentum to carve space rather than absorbing each impact as a fixed-point event. Humans did not win against superior biology by standing still and taking it. They never had. The corridor had taught that lesson in blood. You survived by moving, by using the space and time that your opponent's mass created, by being exactly where you needed to be and nowhere else. Not strength. Not endurance, though you needed enough of both. Position. Timing. The understanding that the biggest being in the room was also the one with the most committed momentum, and committed momentum had a relationship with space that a smaller and more nimble combatant could exploit. He redirected. The boundary striker's limb swept past him and he moved with it rather than against it, turning the force, creating a half-second of distance that he spent on something small and precise. He struck the joint he'd identified in the second exchange as the connection point between Varkezin's upper and lower right forward limb assembly. Not a damaging strike. He had no illusions about damaging Varkezin with his bare hands. A communicating strike. I see this. I have been watching you long enough to see this. Varkezin stopped. The silence in the iron reach was absolute. In the monitoring room 3 levels up, in the assembled academy's packed observation, no one breathed. Varkezin looked at the joint Cale had struck. Then he looked at Cale. You have been reading the geometry, he said. Since you walked in. You identified a leverage point. I identified several. I used the one that would tell you I'd been counting. The pause that followed was long enough that Cale's right knee, freed from the urgency of motion, made itself loudly known. He breathed through it. He stood steady. The blood from the cut above his eye had dried to a dark track down his cheekbone, and his left hand was at his side with the tattoo catching the cold light of the facility. And he was still here, still counting, still exactly where he intended to be. Varkezin paused. In the 17-second breathing space between exchanges, The boundary striker looked at him with that quality of assessment that Kale had felt upon arrival, the sense of being categorized, processed, understood, and there was something different in it now. Not softness, nothing as simple as softness, but a recalibration, a recognition. "You are still standing," Varkazin said. "Yes. Most cadets do not reach this point." "I know. Most species cadets." A pause. "I have not faced a human cadet in approving. I have faced humans in the field, in the corridor. I know what you thought about it." Varkazin was quiet. Then, "I thought you were insufficient based on what I observed." "You observed us winning," Kale said. His voice was steady. The counting was still going. "You observed us winning when every assessment said we shouldn't have been able to, and you called that insufficient. The victory was costly. The methodology was chaotic." "We were civilians," Kale said. "We had been civilians 16 months earlier. We had been station workers and researchers and machine techs, and the kind of people that the rest of the galaxy looks at and sees useful tools and nothing more. And we went into the corridor, and we didn't come out when we should have because we couldn't leave each other behind. And somehow that chaotic, insufficient methodology held long enough for everything else to survive." The iron reach was very quiet. Somewhere above them, the high dark ceiling absorbed the sound. "I have read the same records," Varkazin said. "Then you know what I'm going to tell you." "Tell me anyway." Kale looked at him. His left hand was at his side, the tattoo visible, old ink softened at the edges and sharp at the center, the line along his wrist catching the cold facility light. "The thing you missed," he said, "isn't in any record. It doesn't show up in footage or tactical analysis or after-action reports. You can watch humans fight for 100 years and never see it unless you're in the right conditions to bring it out. The right conditions are exactly these: impossible odds, people you'd die for, no obvious way through." He paused. "The tattoo on my hand was my grandmother's. She wore it into the corridor. She gave it to my mother. My mother gave it to me. It's not a decoration. It's a reminder. It says, you've been here before, in the dark and the cold and the no good reason. You've been here and you came through. And it doesn't live in your head. It lives in your hands." He raised his hand slightly. The geometry of the design was steady in the iron reach's cold light. "Every human who ever stood in an impossible place and held has left something in the next one," he said. "I'm not standing here alone. I'm standing here with everyone who came before me. That's not mysticism. That's what this tattoo means. That's what we are. And you've never seen it because no human has ever stood in front of you close enough and long enough and bloodied enough for you to see it happen." He lowered his hand. "I'm not asking to pass the proving," he said. "I'm asking you to look." Varkazin stood very still. The facility was quiet. Outside, in a room that Kale had no way to know about, a monitoring chamber 3 levels up, where Academy observers who had no power to intervene sat watching the feed. The assembled cadets and instructors of the Vanguard were equally still, watching a live transmission of a human cadet standing bleeding and unbowed before the oldest warrior in the compact, saying words that nobody had said to Varkazin in 200 years of combat history. Then Varkazin said, "I already knew." Kale blinked. "I knew before this exchange began," the boundary striker said. "I knew the moment you entered this facility. I knew from the way you moved and the way you stood and the specific quality of attention you brought into this space. I have seen it once before at the corridor. I saw it then and I called it insufficient and I was wrong." A pause, long and heavy. "I have been wrong about things before. I am seldom wrong about the same thing twice." He moved not into a combat stance but into something else. Something Kale had no frame of reference for, an orientation of body and position that he would only understand later, after Sarenval explained it to him, as the stance of formal acknowledgement. The stance Varkazin took when he recognized a peer. "You have been in this facility for 3 hours and 7 minutes, Varkazin said. You have taken impacts that would have ended the engagement for any prior cadet at this proving. You have not yielded. You have not deceived me. You have not claimed anything you have not earned. Another pause. I knew you had not completed the prerequisite rotations before filing this request. Kale was quiet. I accepted the request, Varkazen said, because I wanted to see if I had been wrong. I wanted to stand in front of a human who would not pretend to be more than they were, who would come into this space as what they are and let me look. He paused one more time. You asked me to look. I have been looking since you walked through the door. The silence in the iron reach stretched long and cold and clean. You pass, Varkazen said. There was a thing the Vanguard did when a cadet passed the proving. It was old. Older than the current academy structure, older than most of the current political arrangements of the Alliance. It came from the founding period, from the 4 warriors who had written it into the compact as both ceremony and intention. The oath. You didn't recite it alone. You recited it in front of witnesses who mattered. That was the point of it, not the words themselves, which were simple, which were the same words that had been said at the founding. The point was who heard them. The point was that the compact was not an abstraction. It was a collection of beings who had looked at each other across difference and decided it meant less than what they were building together. The oath ceremony was held, by convention, in the main assembly hall of the academy. By convention, the attendance was limited to the cadets assigned cohort and the relevant senior staff. The attendance for Kale Morrow's oath ceremony was the full academy. They came because the story had traveled faster than he had. They came from training rooms and mess halls and simulation decks, and the far-end technical wings that rarely sent anyone to these ceremonies. They filled the main assembly hall and the adjacent observation galleries, and spilled into the corridor outside, cadets from 16 star systems pressing close to screens and projected feeds so they could see. Kale stood at the front of the hall in his Vanguard uniform, newly pressed, the rank insignia of a fully certified member attached to the collar, with his left hand visible at his side. Varkazen stood at his right, which was not a position the boundary striker typically occupied at these ceremonies. He stood there because he had asked to. He had told the academy administrators, in the direct and non-negotiable way of someone who had been telling things to administrators for 2 centuries, that he would stand as witness. The other witnesses on the floor included Sarenval, in formal administrative dress, Osek III, in the combat colors she wore for field deployments, Vreeth, the Tessak cadet who had assessed the tactical scenario so well in combat theory, standing with her posture precisely correct, Sherv, the Drelhari cadet, bioluminescent patches cycling through a color combination that Kale had spent the last 3 days learning to read, and had finally decoded, that morning, as the color they used for moments they intended to remember. He stood in front of them all. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the machine shop on Helix Station, the woman who had asked if he understood what it meant to carry something. He thought about the 3 members of his unit from the Kareth survey sector. He thought about his mother, who had sent him off to the academy with the same expression she always had, not worried, not proud, just present, just watching, just trusting the thing she had put in him to hold. He raised his left hand, palm outward, the tattoo facing the room. The assembly hall went silent. 43 species, cadets from 16 systems, the best of what the galaxy sent to the Vanguard, looking at the geometry on a human hand and the human standing behind it. He said the words. They were simple, they were always simple. The compact had been built by people who understood that complicated things broke and simple things held, that what mattered was not the elegance of the language, but the weight of the intention behind it. To stand between, to hold the line, to carry the ones who could not carry themselves, to not yield, to see the thing through to its end, whatever the end turned out to be. He said them clearly, without rushing, without decoration, the way the words wanted to be said. When he finished, Varkazen spoke the witnessing response. Also old, also simple, also carrying the weight of everyone who had said it before. The hall was quiet for a moment. Then Cherv's bioluminescent patches lit up, full brightness, the color for a moment intended to be remembered, and around him the hall came alive. Afterward, in the corridor outside the assembly hall, Cale stood with his back to the wall and let the noise wash around him. Cadets moved past, some nodding, some stopping to say something, some just looking at him in a way that was different from the way they'd looked at him in the mess hall on his first day. Not the frost-spreading quiet of that first morning. Something else. Something that didn't have a name he'd put to it yet. Sarenval found him there. She stood beside him and looked out at the moving corridor for a moment before speaking. Varkazen has been formally requested by 3 other cadets since this morning, she said. All 3 are species who have not previously requested that assignment. Cale looked at her. I mentioned this, she said carefully, without implying causation. Of course, Cale said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you said to me that the assignment was the right one. I asked you to explain and you didn't. No. Would you explain it now? He thought about it. He looked down at his hand, at the tattoo, at the line along his wrist that meant I have counted everything. I am still here. My grandmother told me something when I was 8, he said. She said the ones who mock you haven't seen you yet. Let them look. He paused. Varkazen had the most weight behind that assessment. He had built everything. His opinion was the one that mattered, and he'd never actually seen. Sarenval was quiet. I'm not trying to change the galaxy, Cale said. I'm just trying to be visible in the right place, at the right time. That's all it ever was. She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor moved around them. Outside, somewhere in the facility, in the observation rooms and the training halls and the places where cadets gathered to talk through what they'd watched and what it meant, the story was still spreading, the way stories do when they have something in them worth carrying. Sarenval said, Your first field assignment has been posted. It comes with a recommendation from the boundary striker. In 23 years of my administrative service to this academy, I have never seen that happen. She handed him a chip. He took it. He looked at it. He looked up at the ceiling of the corridor, at the Vanguard Academy installation that had gone quiet when he walked in and was quiet now for an entirely different reason. The quiet of something settling into place, of a thing that had been pending for a long time finally arriving. His grandmother had gone into the corridor. She had come back. She had made something of what she'd carried and passed it on. He was still carrying it. He intended to keep doing so. He put the chip in his pocket, straightened his collar, and went to find out what came next. Vreeth found him first. The Tessak cadet had been among the 90 or so pressed against screens in the overflow corridors during the oath ceremony, and she moved through crowds the way Tessak moved through everything, with precise geometric efficiency, finding the path that was there without insisting on making one. She caught up with him outside the assembly hall's east exit, in a stretch of corridor less crowded than the main artery, and fell into step beside him. They walked for a moment without speaking, which with Tessak could mean many things, and Cale had spent enough time at the academy now to let the silence settle at its own pace. She said eventually, In the briefing room, you said you weren't trying to change the galaxy. I wasn't, he said. You changed my assessment of the proving. He glanced at her. Her posture was precisely correct, as always, the Tessak preference for exact physical positioning that had nothing to do with rigidity and everything to do with intention, every part of her body where she had decided it should be. I filed for Varkazen, she said, this morning before the oath ceremony. He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him with the multifaceted Tessak vision that, he had learned, did not miss much. You watched the engagement feed, he said. All of it 3 times. Vreeth, he paused, you're already excellent, you know that. I know what I am, she said, and I know what I'm not. What I'm not is someone who has been counted by the boundary striker and found worth a nod. She paused. You told him something in there. I read the translated transcript. You told him the right conditions to bring out what you are, impossible odds, people you'd die for, no obvious way through. She paused again. I want him to see what I am in those conditions. He looked at her. He thought about the way she had handled the tactical scenario in OSSEC 3's class, the clean precision of it, the quiet competence. He thought about the old training sergeant at Helix who had told him that the counting look was the look of someone who was usually right. Vreeth had the counting look. He just hadn't been paying enough attention to see it until now. You'll pass, he said. I know, she said without arrogance, just fact, but I want him to know that too. He understood that. He understood it in his hands, in the ink, in the geometry that held the memory of everyone who had stood in impossible places and needed to be seen. Tell me how the transit pod ride goes, he said. It's 3 hours, she said. I'll have time. She moved off down the corridor, finding the geometric path through the crowd, and Cale watched her go and felt something he didn't have a complete word for, the warmth of a thing being passed on. The particular satisfaction of watching someone pick up what you'd been carrying long enough to make it theirs. He turned and walked toward the main exit, and Sheriff was there, leaning against the wall with their patches cycling through colors Cale now had reasonable translations for. Not the complex layered communication they used in their formal interactions, but something simpler, something warm. He stopped in front of them. Sheriff said, Your grandmother was right. He had not known Sheriff knew about his grandmother. He had told the story in the broad strokes during the oath ceremony address, the Academy convention that a newly certified member could speak briefly before the oath if they chose. He had chosen. He had kept it short. He had said what needed to be said. She usually was, he said. Sheriff's patches shifted to the color that meant something like, and now you are too. He did not say anything to that. He didn't need to. There were moments that completed themselves, and this was one of them, and the right response to a moment like that was simply to be in it without filling it up with words. He stood in the corridor of the Vanguard Academy with the cold overhead light on his hand, and the tattoo visible, and the counting in his head steady and clear. And he let the moment be what it was. Then Sheriff pushed off from the wall, and they walked out together into the wider academy, into whatever came next, into the accumulated momentum of everything that had been building toward this since a woman he loved had gotten ink on her hand in the year before the corridor, and decided it meant something worth carrying. It had always meant something worth carrying. He put the chip in his pocket, straightened his collar, and went to find out what came next. 3 months later, a cadet named Tevrash, a Velthari, young, with 2 of the bladed forearm structures that characterized her species, and a chip on her shoulder about roughly everything, stood in the briefing room and listened to her own proving assignment being read out. She had requested Varkazen. She was the second person to pass. She was not the last. In the records of the Vanguard Academy, in the decades that followed, the proving assignments against the boundary striker accumulated into a specific pattern that archivists eventually noticed and flagged for historical significance. The requests had gone, after a 31-year gap, from rare to steady to the most filed assignment in the Academy's catalog. Analysts who studied the pattern found the inflection point without difficulty. It was the same year, same month, same 3-hour engagement in the Iron Reach, same cadet standing bloodied and unbowed with his left hand raised, and the old geometry of an old design facing the room. What the reports could not capture, what no record ever quite managed to hold, was the way the tattoo had looked in the Iron Reach's cold light. Old ink softened at the edges, sharp at the center, the weight of everyone who had worn it before, the counting. Still here. Always still here. That was the thing about humans in the end. That was always the thing that was hard to see until you were standing close enough in the right conditions. They carried each other. Across distance, across time, across every reasonable assessment of what they ought to have been able to survive. They carried each other in their hands, in their ink, in the quiet stubbornness of being the species that would not, under any conditions, accept the assessment that they were insufficient. Not because they were the strongest. Because they remembered. Because they passed it on. Because Cale Morrow had walked into the Vanguard Academy with a duffel and a transfer chip, and a tattoo his grandmother had worn into the worst engagement in 3 sectors, and he had stood in front of the oldest warrior in the known galaxy and said, "You have not seen us yet." And Varkazin had looked. And the galaxy had shifted, by exactly the amount that one honest look can shift it, which is, as it turns out, considerable.